during the PSI training, I kind of had this aha moment. Because, right, I was like kind of jaded about that. Like, we know all this stuff and nothing about birth, and that's male dominated, and blah, blah, blah. The patriarchy. Thank you. Perfect reaction to the P word. But in that training, what we learned about, a lot of it was like, for the general population, not knowing what to do, not having protocol, not having ideas of what you're supposed to do, like what do you do now? And I will say, like, that's a strength that we have. That's a strength that I overlooked. That's a strength that I saw that connects us to this work. And something that we talked about is we do have customs. We do have protocols. Maybe they're not exactly related to the infant, but when somebody passes away, there's usually like a protocol that happens. There's usually an amount of days, depending on your tribe, before you're buried. There's somebody you call, there's somebody in the family who is gonna like get everybody together and tell you where to go and get everything set up. There's people who are gonna come over and drop off food to your family. Like, there are things that just kind of take place. And I remember being able to see that after I was getting my degree, my bachelor's degree at SKC, my senior year, my uncle passed away. And I was explaining to somebody about how, we always talk about Indigenous communities as all of these negative things, but you really do see our strengths during that time because we all come together and we grieve collectively. Even if you didn't know them directly, you knew their family, you'll likely still come and sit with them at a wake. Or at the very least, you'll swing around back of the community center and you'll drop off bread, you'll drop off drinks, you'll drop off chips, you'll contribute to the feed somehow if you can't be there. And that's just like a super normal, common thing that people do all the time. Like, someone passed away, all right, let's cook, let's make a cake, like everybody contributes. And while it's a shame that we know so much about that versus birth, it is a strength that we have that is related to this work. And this is a list of Indigenous cultural strengths from the SAMHSA culture card. And a lot of these strengths you'll see a lot of culture. You'll probably hear an Indigenous language in a prayer at a wake or at a funeral. People will be smudging. Elders will be there to come together. It's as hard and sad as it is, it's a way like our culture is passed down. All that to say that we are familiar with death. We do know how to grieve. While there are unhealthy coping mechanisms and all of that, we're resilient and we come together. That is something that probably we've had to learn how to do because of all of the impacts of colonization and federal Indian policies and whatnot. So we know how to grieve. I used this picture, Jules, that you drew. Jules, you want to give them a little wave? This is in our cultural safety toolkit. And Jules, we're both Cree. And so she has the moon up there, and that's why it's called looking after our life givers, because the moon is like grandmother moon and looking after this young family who are having babies and whatnot. So to kind of bring it back to cultural safety, for those of you who haven't been to my recent cultural safety trainings, this is my new AI definition of cultural safety. Google did know this. But it's the concept of creating an environment where people feel safe and respected and their identities and experiences are not challenged or denied. And it's not just healthcare, right? It's in your workplace, it's in education. Cultural safety is really everywhere. I mean, it should be everywhere. So when I'm thinking of that, and what I preach what I get on my soapbox about is in specifically like labor and delivery units, in WIC offices, and all of that, making sure that there's room for cultural strengths. Like that's what I try to help people understand how to do. What the heck was that? Okay. Okay. Emotional responses and stages of grief. So this is just general information, like things we learned at the PSI training, right? There are different emotional responses. It's non-linear. I feel like this is relevant for everybody, right? Like even if someone is Indigenous, they're still human, right? And I think even that is something that in this work, we've really been trying to uphold, because a lot of times and in the past, we have been dehumanized. So just reminding, like, we're human too, we deserve care and compassion, and we're gonna have similar emotional responses. And then things that are common myths of like, they'll feel better, or time heals all wounds, basically things that you shouldn't say. And thinking of like our role that's instilled in us about being a life giver, and then that life, being taken away. There are some cultural differences that you may hear about, as like there might be a lot of extra blame and shame, because that's like kind of our role and what our gift is. And so there might be extra guilt and maybe loss of identity in that. So this empathy and compassion here, some things like what to say, just like everybody else. I'm here for you. I'm sorry for your loss. Don't say, everything happens for a reason. While there is that interconnectedness that we do believe in, that's like not the time or the place. That active listening, I talk about that in cultural safety, where there might be moments of deep silence, deep listening and reflection before someone says something. So there'll probably be long pauses, or there might not be anything because people don't know what to say. So give them time and space before they decide to put their words out into the universe, right? One thing that can be done though is create safe spaces for families to express their grief. Thinking of things just like in birth, smudging, making room for visitors, allowing people to stay there, validating emotions without judgment. When I was first doing cultural safety trainings, one example that I had heard about was a woman telling me when her baby passed away that they just thought that everybody would just leave. Or, like, okay, well, that was, okay, that happened, and, we're really sorry, and here, here's your resources, and then let's get on. But more people kept coming. Like, more people kept showing up, and they were like, why is everybody coming? The baby passed away. There's no baby here to meet. Well, usually with Indigenous people, with my tribe and my community, I know for sure that you don't leave the body. The body, someone stays with the body at all times until it's time for the burial. And that's just my community, but a lot of people, I know a lot of other tribes that have similar ways, so that might be something. So don't be too surprised if more and more people show up. How can we accommodate that? So some practicable tools here is refer Native patient care representatives and local, refer them to Native patient care representatives and local Indigenous birth workers, right? And I say that because, one, to like manifest it, but I've heard of situations where a certain hospital or a clinic does have somebody hired to help be a liaison for their Native patients, to help care for their Native patients. And this has went really well. I haven't heard specifically of infant loss, but loss in general, where they would come in and they would be able to comfort the family because of our kinship networks. There's usually some relation or somebody, and they said, oh, well, you're this tribe, I know so-and-so, do you want me to ask them to come in? And they were like, really? We can do that? So that's why it's important for like Indigenous-led work and to bring in and pay Indigenous people to do this kind of work. Also, there are a lot of us Indigenous birth workers who were able to take this training and were really able to recognize like, oh, this is some stuff we need to work on, and how can we support each other when something like this happens at a birth or whatnot. So it's really, I think like one thing that I say in the cultural safety trainings, and it might also be a slide, but it's worth repeating, is that you don't need to understand culture. Like, it's not on non-natives to like facilitate a cultural practice or to engage in a cultural practice, but it is up to you to help make that connection, right? Just like Tara was saying, and the doulas were saying, right? Like, we need people to make those connections to get them to, I guess, the experts, right? And having local Indigenous birth workers, I know at least the ones who did the training would be more than happy to help. In our Facebook group, we've been able to help one another and give each other ideas for when a situation like this happened. So yes, accommodating those elders, those knowledge keepers, people who are coming to support the family, letting them know that they're welcome, helping them feel welcome. So recognizing that there's going to be these cultural differences. So one thing, and I have some examples of things to say, but just recognizing that N equals 1, some tribes are going to have certain belief systems that need to be accommodated, and make sure that you're asking about their cultural preferences so that something that is very upsetting to them doesn't happen. And I know mistakes are going to be made, but just really be mindful about that and understand that some of these really common but really Western-based medical practices may not align with some cultural beliefs, so it's really important to ask for consent and to even ask the family too. I've heard that where there's a lot of shock, there's a lot of grief happening, and you're unable to really get information from the parent. I think when you're asking about like cultural practices and whatnot, you could also ask the family. You can ask their mom. You can ask an elder, is there anything I should know? Is there any cultural preferences I should know? Because oftentimes it's the elder of the family who's going to be organizing things and can help you understand what needs to be done or what shouldn't be done in the hospital. So again, this is why Native birth work is so important. We got to hear a lot about what doulas are. Indigenous birth workers are just like regular doulas, except for we're approaching the work in a sacred way that's congruent to our culture. So this is really a time that's a sacred time, coming to earth, coming earthside, and leaving back into the spirit world. That's a sacred time. And an Indigenous doula who is serving the community will have skills and will have knowledge to help this process. So here are just some examples that I literally thought of what I would want to hear if I was in this situation, or I've tweaked things that I've heard that have been helpful. So really just making space, right? Recognizing that it's different. Recognizing that culture is important. Recognizing that Indigenous people have cultural strengths that can be really beneficial during these times. So one example, are there any cultural beliefs or preferences our team should know about? Right? That's not too scary, is it? Please know we respect and understand the importance of Native culture. If you'd like to invite an elder or knowledge keeper, we can accommodate that. This third one is one of my favorites because I say this all the time, and we've got to help a lot of clinics and hospitals amp up, beef up, create, let people know about their smudging policies. Because they do exist, and then if they don't, then someone takes the training and they go back to their hospital and like, hey, now we have one. So it's been really exciting. So it's not like you guys have to learn how to smudge, or you don't have to have smudge, and maybe if you have a Native care representative within your hospital, maybe they do have smudge. But you can always say, I see that your chart says you're Native American. If you want, you're welcome to smudge here. Just let us know so I could turn off the whatchamacallit or, XYZ, whatever the protocol is. So those are some ways that you can facilitate cultural strengths. So I know this is a lot shorter presentation, but I really just wanted to give some brief thoughts and ideas on how, what you can do now. I think today in general of the conference is really trying to think about what you can take home with you as far as information. So the key takeaways here are that people grieve in different ways, that compassion and support is super crucial, and that making space for these cultural strengths is healing. You can help start the healing process. Healing, in the Western medicine way is important, and indigenous healing is just as important, right? That two-eyed seeing that I sometimes talk about. Aw, there's a typo. Refer to local or other indigenous-led resources, right? There's not a lot out there. We know that there's not, specific bereavement groups and whatnot, but it is important to get people help, and that's why these indigenous birth worker networks that are growing are really important. There might be someone nationally, like Center for Indigenous Midwifery, other organizations that might have information that you can use. I'll also do some digging, because if there are, then we'll make sure we have them on the NAI website. But it's not something that's really talked a lot about, and I really do believe that the work that the Indigenous birth workers are doing in the state are going to help revitalize this information and help be a resource for you all when you're serving Indigenous families. So, Giniheyan, thank you. I have a few minutes for some questions. Oh, yeah. Jessica, the fact that you even asked that question is Montana is making some strides. Thank you all. That is a really good question. And I would say, if they're serving your community, especially urban communities, there's going to be people from multiple different tribes. And so if they're an Indigenous doula in your community or somewhere else, it is worth an ask to just say, hey, we have, or talk to them ahead of time even to say, if this comes up, would you be able to help? Jules is in Haver, all of that. I think that's important, but that is a good point, right? We don't want to overburden Indigenous people in general. I talk a lot about that emotional labor for Indigenous people and Native people having to educate their staff and just assuming that they're going to be able to do X, Y, Z. But if it is your hospital person, I don't know any hospitals in Montana or anywhere that say, okay, well, we have 12 nations in Montana, so we need 12 different people here. I think I'm obviously advocating for people to hire Indigenous people to do this work, but that'll be, someone I knew was from Fort Belknap, and she had patients, or she helped all the different patients, and she's also usually just facilitating. She also knows somebody. So I guess to say, if it's somebody who is at a hospital and is getting a salary and that's their job to advocate for Native patients, then yes, definitely contact them. And if they're an Indigenous doula and that's their role and that's how they're serving the community, then yes, contact them. But the fact that you know that, hey, there's an issue here, if they're Lakota and I only know like Salish people, it probably wouldn't be appropriate if you were serving somebody who's Lakota and Kalispel and you called over to CSKT Res to be like, hey, how do I help them? That wouldn't be appropriate. But if you knew an Indigenous birth worker, I can't imagine Misty being like, nope, only Northern Cheyenne and Lakota, So I think that's a really good thing to be mindful of, and being careful on how you move, but still finding a way to move, right? Cool. I'm sorry?
What is a birth wolf? Explain the cultural meaning behind that.
Birth wolf?
On here you had the birth wolves. A photo of it?
A what? I don't know. I must have typoed again somewhere. Are you talking about birth workers?
I thought there was a picture of a birth wolf. Oh, no, you're too close. Yeah. It was on a picture.
Oh. No.
Birth workers. Birth workers. Yeah.
Okay. I was like, somebody help, SOS. Yeah. Like, I don't know. No, for sure. Sorry. Thank you. That's good. No, it's good. And then I'm the one to like I'm getting paid to answer this. So ask me. Don't ask your patients or your clients, right? So yes, happy to clear up. There may be birth wolves in some culture, but I am not familiar.
I think going back to this lady's question over here, Amy, maybe even going back to your slide, your pre-questions, I think would be beneficial just even to know that as a starting place.
Oh.
Forward.
This?
Are there any cultural beliefs or preferences, or no, not that one. Well, no, that was the right page, sorry. That was right.
Oh.
Like 2 and 3, I think those would be great starting points. So yes, we know you're this, but actually asking them that so then they can be like, oh, okay, and then proceed to give you information.
And if they can't be here, phoning them in, right? That might not be okay for some people, but I know of people who are doing mental health work and have had permission as an Indigenous person, sought the right protocol and got permission from some spiritual leaders to have a song on their phone that they could play for somebody. And that's something too that we're revitalizing, is songs and whatnot that we can sing for our relatives and whatnot in that time. Yes. Mm-hmm.
I remember when I had my kids ask me that question. Are there any cultural beliefs or preferences that we should know about? And I was like, no. Because to me some things were a given, and so I didn't know to put that in that category.
Mm-hmm.
Do you find in your experience that someone who's Native might have the same response and not know what to respond to that?
Yes.
And just for providers to understand that if they don't say anything, doesn't necessarily mean there's nothing.
Totally. Yep.
Does that make sense?
That does, and that's why I say ask their mom, ask an elder. And a lot of times when I talk about this, it's I feel like a fish trying to explain water, because I'm like, oh, that's cultural. And honestly, I didn't understand that, as a Native person who had gone to all these funerals, I think I was out of high school and I finally went to a non-Native funeral or viewing, or it was my mind was blown. It was completely different. So I didn't know that there was a difference. I just assumed everybody did the same. It's, this is my world. So I think that is totally important to understand. And also too, not just that, but maybe there are people who are reconnecting with their culture, or who haven't been able to access their cultural strengths and knowledge like other people have. So, really be mindful and not making them feel bad. But I think just letting them know that you can be Native here. You know, you're able to be who you are and still receive quality care. Like that, I think just creating that space is reassuring. But that is also a great segue to a panel that we're having this afternoon and some work done by our very own Chelsea Bellon. She did her Apex work and worked with a number of different people to create, we literally just changed the name based on our panel discussion a couple days ago, for Indigenous Birth Preferences Guide. So that ahead of time, when somebody's pregnant, they can see that and they can think, oh, that's cultural. I should tell them that. You know, not everybody saves the belly button. Oh my gosh, I gotta tell them that. You know, so that ahead of time. But on the provider's end, it's a tool that you can use to like ask these kinds of questions, so that 8 years later they're not still like mortified that somebody threw the baby's belly button away.